But the legionaries, their anger now further inflamed by the anonymous pamphlets that were being circulated from hand to hand, vilifying Constantius and declaring him unworthy of imperial office, would have none of it. By evening, Julian saw that he was faced with no longer just with the disaffection of his troops, but with open mutiny. And even then, he called upon the gods to witness. He had no idea what was in the soldiers' minds. Were they planning to proclaim him as their Augustus or to tear him to pieces? Just about sunset, when Julian had retired to an upper chamber of the palace for some much-needed rest, a trembling chamberlain came to report that the army was marching on the palace. Julian writes later on, "Then, peering through a window, I prayed to Zeus, and as the shouting grew louder and the tumult spread to the palace itself, I entreated the god to give me a sign, and he did so, bidding me cede to the will of the army and make no opposition against it. And even then I did not yield without reluctance, but resisted as long as I could, refusing to accept either the acclamation or the diadem. But since I alone could not control so many, and since, moreover, the gods whose will it was sapped my resolution, somewhere about the third hour, some soldier or other gave me the collar." I'll explain what that means in a moment. And put it on my head and returned to the palace. I lamenting as the gods knew in my heart. Well, does Julian, we might ask, perhaps protest a little too much? There is no evidence that he conspired against Constantius, true, nor that he would ever have wavered in his loyalty if that fateful order for reinforcements had not ultimately made loyalty impossible. But his 4.5 years in Gaul had taught him courage and confidence, and had given him for the first time political ambitions. By now, too, he seems to have believed himself divinely appointed to restore the old religion to the empire. And it seems unlikely, to say the least, that once he had received, or thought he had received, a sign from Zeus, he should have continued to show much reluctance at all to accept the diadem. Now, here's the part about the collar. The only problem was that no diadem existed. Ammianus Marcellinus, that historian I referred to a moment ago, was a member of the imperial bodyguard, and he was almost certainly in Paris at the time when this was happening, and was therefore probably an eyewitness of much of what took place. He wrote that the soldiers first proposed to crown Julian with his wife's necklace because they didn't have any crown on hand. When Julian objected that female adornments would be unsuitable for such a purpose, they suggested the frontlet of a horse, but once again he demurred. At last, one of the standard bearers tore the great gold chain from his neck, an emblem of his office, and placed it on Julian's head. So the challenge then, unwilling or not, had been flung down. The die had been cast. There could be no going back. Julian was now a claimant, a usurper. Julian, therefore, was in no hurry to march east. Of course, he had to go east to go and fight Constantius, right? That's how these sort of things work. Once your army proclaimed your emperor, you proclaimed a person emperor, and that person accepted, you had to go and beat the other emperor. Julian was in no hurry to do this, though. The distance involved in marching east was immense, and he was far from certain of the loyalties of the many imperial garrisons that were stationed along the way. If they were to maintain their allegiance to Constantius, he might well find his way blocked, and quite possibly his retreat as well. He preferred, therefore, to bide his time, to send ambassadors to his cousin, Constantius, informing him of what had occurred and suggesting that some kind of accommodation between them might be found. The envoys found Constantius at Caesarea, now Kayseri, in Cappadocia, ironically enough, on that very same estate of Macellum, where Julian had kept his youth for 6 years, had been basically a kind of under house arrest by Constantius himself. On receiving the message, Constantius flew into a rage so furious that the messengers at first feared for their own lives. For the moment, though, tied down as he was in the east, all he could do openly was to send Julian a stern warning. In secret, however, he began to encourage the barbarian tribes along the Rhine to renew their offensive. That way, Constantius might at least tie down his rival and prevent him from any eastward advances, you see. In the short term, this plan proved moderately successful, and for much of the remainder of the year, Julian found himself fully occupied on the frontier, putting down incursions by the German barbarians. But then in late October, he moved south to Vienne in France, where on the 6th of November, he celebrated the 5th anniversary of his inauguration as Caesar, wearing, Ammianus Marcellinus tells us, quote, a splendid diadem inlaid with precious stones, though when first entering on this power, he had worn but a paltry-looking crown like that of a president of the public games, end quote. The coming of spring saw more trouble on the Rhine, put down only after a somewhat discreditable episode in which the chieftain of the Alemanni, a Germanic tribe, had been invited to dinner by the local Roman commander and was almost certainly on Julian's orders arrested as soon as he crossed his host's threshold. But by then it had become clear that negotiations between the two emperors were getting nowhere, and that Constantius, taking advantage of a lull in the Persian campaign, was now preparing an all-out offensive against his cousin. Julian, we read, was still profoundly uncertain about how to react best, whether to meet him halfway, securing as best he could the allegiance of the troops stationed along the Danube, or whether to wait for him in Gaul, on his own home turf, as it were, where he could be sure of his troops. Once again, he prayed to the gods for a sign, and once again, we are told it was vouchsafed to him. Pausing only to make a ritual sacrifice of a bull to the goddess Bellona, the war goddess, Julian assembled his army at Vienne and set out for the east. Now, the Rhine could not be left entirely undefended. Moreover, if the whole story about the refusal of the Gallic troops to leave their homeland were not a complete fabrication, then there must have been several units reluctant to follow their emperor on this new expedition. Julian thus had only some 23,000 fighting men on whom to rely, pitifully few in comparison with the number that Constantius could be expected to hurl against him. To conceal this disparity and to make his strength appear greater than it actually was, he therefore broke up his army into three. 10,000 were to cross the Alps into North Italy and make their way through modern-day Croatia. A similar number were simultaneously to march through Raetia and Noricum, an area roughly corresponding to Switzerland and the Tyrol region of the Alps in northern Italy and western Austria. Finally, a select group of 3,000 men under Julian himself were to head south through the southern part of the Black Forest to the upper Danube in the neighborhood of Ulm, and there to embark on boats and sail downstream. All three columns were to meet at Sirmium on the river Sava, which is some 20 miles to the west of the modern Serbian capital of Belgrade. Not surprisingly, Julian's detachment arrived first. The impatient emperor decided against waiting and pressed on to the south, though, pausing only when he reached Naissus, where he had decided to pass the winter and consolidate. He had been there only 3 or 4 weeks when messengers arrived from the capital with very surprising news. Constantius was dead. Moreover, Julian had already been acclaimed emperor by the massed armies of the East. And so therefore, the whole struggle for power, the whole would-be civil war, was over almost before it had begun. Constantius, the messengers explained, had been at Hierapolis. This is the modern-day city of Manbij in northern Syria. Constantius had been there when he had, most unwillingly, taken the decision to march against his rival. He had retraced his steps as far as Antioch and had just set out on the 700 miles to Constantinople when he had come upon a headless corpse by the roadside, which, of course, he immediately took for an evil omen. By the time he reached Tarsus in southern central Turkey, Constantius was stricken by a low-grade fever, but he refused to stop and dragged himself on a mile or two to the little village of Mopsu Korenai, and there it became clear that he could go no further, and there on the 3rd of November, 361, he died. Until that last illness, he had always enjoyed perfect health. He was only 44 years old. Well, to Julian, this was yet another proof that the gods were working on his behalf. Neither then nor later, however, did he show any sign of relief or jubilation. He hastened rather on to Constantinople in order to be present when the body of his predecessor reached the capital. On the day of its arrival, he himself, dressed in the deep mourning cloths of pure black that he had ordered for the whole city, was on the dock side, the side of the dock, the pier, to supervise the unloading of the coffin. Later, he led the funeral procession to the Church of the Holy Apostles, weeping unabashedly, and as far as we can tell, genuinely, at his own father's murderer and his own lifelong enemy, now laid to rest. Only after the ceremony was over did he assume the attributes of empire, and he never entered a Christian church again. Within days of Julian's accession to the imperial throne, it was plain to all in Constantinople that the new regime was going to provide a marked contrast to the old. A military tribunal was established at Chalcedon across the Bosphorus to try certain of Constantius's chief ministers and advisors, whom the new emperor suspected of having abused their powers. Some were acquitted, others let off with periods of banishment or forced residence. But several were condemned to death, including two, the sinisterly named Paul the Chain and his collaborator Apodemius, joint chiefs of Constantius's detested intelligence network, who were summarily sentenced to be buried alive. More deserving of sympathy was Ursulus, who had served Julian with distinction in Gaul as his minister of finance, and who, though subsequently transferred to the east, had never shown him the slightest disloyalty. Some years before, however, at the siege of Amida in Upper Mesopotamia, this Ursulus had unwisely cast aspersions on the empire's military efficiency, and the Eastern generals had never forgiven him. Julian had taken care not to be a member of the tribunal himself. As emperor, however, he could have easily intervened to save his old friend, and it was a disappointment to many, such as Ammianus Marcellinus, many of his admirers, that he did not do so. Well, now that he was sole ruler of the Roman Empire, Julian decided that there is something that everybody needs to know, and that is the fact that he was a pagan. This came as a tremendous shock to Christians, who had no idea that a pagan had somehow managed to accede to the imperial office. And Julian made a great deal out of his paganism. He celebrated his accession to the throne by holding animal sacrifices of the sort that had not been seen by the population in Constantinople ever, definitely for several decades, certainly, at least not publicly. And perhaps his most famous symbolic gesture towards paganism involved his facial hair. Julian decided upon becoming emperor that it wasn't enough simply to hold animal sacrifices. He also wanted to look like an old pagan philosopher. And so he was going to grow a beard, a great big Socrates-like beard of the sort that most Roman emperors never really wore. His beard became the subject of considerable public controversy as people wrote pamphlets in support of it or against it. Julian himself was very sensitive to mockery, and especially mockery from Christians directed his way because of his kind of, shall we say, retro look. And therefore, he wrote a little treatise himself in defense of his beard called the Misopagon, or the beard hater, the hater of the beard. Well, the beard was symbolic, though, and kind of just totally ridiculous, side issue. Some of his actions were quite substantial. Julian, just to reconnect with something that I began tonight's lecture with, Julian decided to find that altar of victory, dig it out of storage, and move it back into the Roman Senate house, where it, quote unquote, belonged. In the palace itself, the new broom was even more dramatically apparent. Ever since the days of Diocletian, the emperor had been growing more and more of a being apart, separated from his subjects by a court increasingly rigid with ceremonial and approachable only by his senior ministers in the intervals between their successive prostrations, and surrounded by whole regiments of domestics whose numbers increased with every passing year. As Libanius was later to claim in his funeral oration on Julian, Julian next turned his attention to the state of the imperial court, where he found a useless horde of people maintained to no purpose. There were 1,000 cooks, as many barbers, and even more butlers. There were swarms of waiters, eunuchs, more in number than flies around the flocks in spring, and a multitude of drones of every sort and kind. There was one refuge for such idle gluttons, to have the name and title of being one of the emperor's household, and in very quick time, a piece of gold would ensure their enrollment. All these, maintained to no purpose by the imperial purse, he regarded not as servants, but as nuisances, and so expelled them forthwith. And the purge that followed Julian's arrival was swift and thorough. Literally thousands of chamberlains and majordomos and of grooms and barbers and bodyguards, and, you name it, were summarily dismissed without compensation, until the emperor was left only with the skeleton staff required to meet his own needs, those of a single man, because his wife Helena had died by now. And he lived a very ascetic lifestyle. He was celibate. He never took another wife, certainly didn't take mistresses. Food and drink were of little interest, and as were general creature comforts altogether. He had no interest in that sort of thing at all. Very kind of very unique kind of person in this regard, given the fact that he was a neo-pagan and an emperor, somebody who could have any kind of luxury that he wanted to at this time. Similarly, radical reforms were made in the government and administration, usually in the direction of the old republican tradition. So there was, for example, a significant increase in the power of the Senate, which Julian henceforth made a point of attending regularly and in person, traveling there on foot as a sign of respect. The taxation system was tightened up and rationalized. So too were the imperial communications, and in particular the cursus publicus, which ensured the proper provision of horses, mules, and oxen for the transport of government servants traveling on duty and for the carriage of official freight. Once famous for its efficiency, this cursus publicus had been allowed by Constantius to fall into the hands of unscrupulous agents, whose animals were often so overworked and undernourished that, as Libanius tells us, quote, most of them dropped down dead as soon as they were unhitched, or even before, while they were still in their traces, end quote. But all these measures were of the kind that perhaps any strong ruler might enforce on succeeding a weak and corrupt regime. Where Julian stands alone among all the emperors of Byzantium, or the late Roman Empire, is in his convinced and dedicated paganism. During his years as Caesar, he had been obliged to pay lip service to the Christian faith. And as late as April 361, we find him attending Easter liturgy at Vienne in France. But his inner rejection of that faith had long been an open secret, and from the moment that the news was brought to him at Naissus of Constantius's death, he made no more pretense. It was, therefore, as a professed pagan that he attended his predecessor's funeral in the Church of the Holy Apostles at Constantinople, and as a pagan that he settled down, after much divine consultation, to frame the laws which he was convinced would ultimately eliminate Christianity and reestablish the worship of the old gods throughout the Roman Empire. There would be, he believed, no need, though, for persecutions. This is a very interesting point. There were relatively few martyrs under Julian's reign, because he reckoned persecution meant martyrs, and martyrs always seemed to have a salubrious effect on the Christian church. He understood this, of course, from his upbringing. The truth of Tertullian's statement that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, as we've seen right on up until our own day, that the more persecuted the church is, the more it thrives, and the more converts it attracts. And he didn't want that. And so the first thing he did was to repeal the decrees by which pagan temples had been closed, their property confiscated, and their sacrifices declared illegal. Then, in the ensuing atmosphere of putatively complete religious toleration, and he proclaimed an amnesty for all those Orthodox Christian churchmen whom the pro-Arian government of Constantius had sent into exile. So all of the sons of Constantine, definitely Constantius, were Arian Christians. Of course, Constantine was Nicene Orthodox, but and you know what all that means now, so I don't have to go into that. But Constantius's regime had been very pro-Arian and therefore had exiled many Orthodox churchmen. Now this decision was reversed, and so there was a general amnesty. All of those exiled Orthodox Christians could now be returned to the empire and to Constantinople. And now this decision to make all forms of religious worship legal, paganism, Judaism, Christianity, and all different brands of Christianity, Orthodoxy, Arianism, and any one of a number of other Christian sects, heretical sects. All of this, he proclaimed all of these forms of worship to be legal. But it is important to note that this legalization was not rooted in Julian's love of multiculturalism and tolerance. His opponents accused him, probably correctly, of making all forms of Christianity legal out of very cynical calculations, namely that he made Arianism and Orthodoxy legal, equally on the same footing legally, in the hope that these various Christian groups, now that they were on a level playing field, would rip each other apart and destroy each other and essentially do his dirty work for him. It was certainly something that Julian was capable of calculating and doing, for, as Ammianus Marcellinus notes, Julian had found by experience that no wild beasts are so hostile to men as are Christian sects in general to one another. I would like to just pause and reflect on this idea for a moment, because that's obviously a very negative view, and it must be dealt with. It is a fact that militant atheism only has come into existence in the world in Christian lands, or in places where it has come into being that are not dominantly Christian, such as China or North Korea or something like that. It always, that ideology of militant atheism, of killing people simply because they are Christians, that ideology came there via the West and through Marxism, right? Through communism, which of course is an invention of Marx in the West. So in other words, we're thrown back onto the same principle that militant atheism, the desire to line people up against the wall and kill them, simply for being professed Christians, that only has come into being in the West. One can think of the French Revolution, the desecration of churches, of graves of Christian kings, the killing of clergy, which of course is standard feature every time there's a kind of Marxist revolution in any country. And we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Okay, why is it that militant atheism never has arisen organically, naturally, in, say, an Islamic country, in India, in a Buddhist country, in any of these other places, where people, there certainly will be people in those places who deep in their hearts reject the belief system. Atheism, in some sense, is as old as the hills. The Psalms themselves, the Psalms of King David in the Old Testament, say, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. So the idea of atheism, disbelief in the existence of God, is not necessarily a new thing, although it was pretty rare up until the French Revolution. But why is it that militant atheism, the desire to wipe religion off the face of the earth, only comes into being in Christian societies and then into other places via formerly Christian societies, the ideology of the West. Well, ideologies developed in the West. And I would say there are two different reasons for this. One of them is metaphysical, and we don't have to get into that now. I would say that metaphysically, the rejection of Christianity is ontologically different than the rejection of any other belief system, because it is ultimately the truth. And once that truth is rejected, there is nothing left there to fill the void, as it were. Nothing left except for nihilism. But we'll put that position off to the side, because not everyone would accept that, obviously. But I would say that there is maybe another more human reason, and that is the fact that hypocrisy is really a charge that unfortunately can be leveled with justification at many Christians. Okay, in fact, most Christians. The ideals of Christianity are indeed so very high that if one fulfills them, one is a saint. And anything less than that is somehow not really living up to the high ideals of Christianity. And hypocrisy is one of those things that even the youngest child can perceive as somehow disgraceful, is somehow wrong. When a person preaches something that they do not practice, or fails to live up to the ideals that they set for others. And it produces a sense of moral outrage that I do believe in some ways on a human level does facilitate the rise of militant atheism. And you can see this particularly in the writings or in the speeches, indeed, of some of the people that I've talked about in this course so far, like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris. These atheistic, I don't want to call them intellectuals, but, spokesmen, polemicists, there's the word. These atheist polemicists who, they speak with, especially Christopher Hitchens, who is dead now, but he spoke with such moral pathos, again, that it's not right, for God to exist when there's suffering in this world. It's not right for, people to feel like, that somehow everything about them is special because they believe in God or something like that. He had this real sense of like moral pathos, but you can see in a totally godless universe, there would be no reason to be morally outraged about anything. The gazelle gets eaten by the lion, and then the lion moves on, and there's no moral outrage there. It's all just part of a, natural cycle of things. Yet somehow, because Christianity teaches certain moral ideals, and when a person sees that the professors of those ideals don't live up to them, it produces this kind of militant atheism. So I don't want to go off on too much of a rant here, but I just want to leave that thought with you there and say that, of course, that is there is some justice to that objection. But at the same time, though, just because a person doesn't live up to the ideals of Christianity does not logically make Christianity false. One is totally capable of both things can be true. A person can be a hypocrite and still the faith is still true. So and oftentimes my experience has been that when people abandon their faith because they see Christians acting hypocritically, it's almost always because there was something else psychological going on there. Atheism is never a scientific proposition about the world. There is nothing in science that teaches that God doesn't exist. Science doesn't have jurisdiction over anything beyond the physical world. So you cannot use science to justify a supernatural claim. And I would say that whenever people that I've met who are atheists, it's always because of some psychological factor, something deeper in their own history that has caused them to feel that way. Indeed, Christopher Hitchens, when I keep using him as the example, his own mother, whom he was very close with, committed suicide when he was a young person, and that really screwed him up. And he even talks about that himself inside of his autobiography. So, and it was around that time that he kind of felt more confirmed in his anti-God stance. Well, to bring things back to Julian, Julian wanted to show that paganism was not dead and that it was still philosophically vital, that it could still offer a viable explanation for the nature of the world. He therefore wrote philosophical treatises designed to show that paganism could still answer the most important questions in life. And after that, he believed it would only be a question of time before the Christians saw the error of their ways and embraced once again the old faith that they should have never left. Now, such reasoning, oversimplified though it may be, must seem to modern minds quite impossibly naive. Julian, however, was a unique combination of Roman emperor, Greek philosopher, and mystic. As an emperor, he knew that his empire was sick. It no longer functioned as it had in the old golden age of the Antonines 2 centuries earlier. The army had lost much of its invincibility and was now more often than not barely able to keep the peace along the frontier. The government, for its part, was inefficient, plagued by corruption, and because of the bifurcation of religious loyalties now between Christian and pagan, there was, diversity was not a strength in Julian's eyes. The old Roman virtues of reason, duty, honor, integrity were gone. The emperors themselves, his immediate predecessors, had been sensualists and sybarites living in an unreal world of fantasy and self-indulgence, he thought. Still, though, capable perhaps of leading their forces into battle when absolutely necessary, but they were happier by far to recline in their palaces, surrounded by their women and eunuchs. And all of this, clearly, was the result of moral degradation for Julian. As a philosopher, Julian was not prepared, though, to leave it at that. He was determined to discover the cause of the decline, and because he was a deeply religious person, living in an age in which men instinctively sought spiritual solutions to worldly problems, he concluded that this all-important question of why the empire was so degraded could be answered in a single word: Christianity. Here, as he saw it, was a faith that rode roughshod over the old virtues, emphasizing instead such effete feminine qualities as gentleness, meekness, and the turning of the other cheek. Worse still, it preached the disastrous creed of free and easy absolution. In a curious little composition entitled The Caesars, composed for the Saturnalia of December 362, Julian makes his views clear enough, picturing Christ, whom he has taken up in the abode of incontinence, crying aloud to all comers, "Let every seducer, every murderer, every man guilty of sacrilege, every scoundrel come unto me without fear. For with this water I will wash him and straightway make him clean. And though he should be guilty of those same sins a second time, let him but smite his breast and beat his head, and I will make him clean again." In a word, then, Christianity had for Julian emasculated the empire, robbing it of its strength and its manhood, and substituting a moral fecklessness whose effects were everywhere apparent. Comparisons with other places and periods are always dangerous, yet to say that Julian looked on the Christians of the 4th century in something of the light that, say, an old conservative of the old school, kind of a William Buckley kind of person, might have looked upon the hippies and flower people of the 1960s might not be too wide of the mark. Conservatives of the old school, like William Buckley, however, are not normally mystics, but by contrast, Julian was. Dearly as he loved philosophical and theological debate, his approach to religion was always emotional rather than intellectual. Seldom during his short reign did he miss an opportunity of publicizing his views, shocking many of his subjects, pagan as well as Christian, by descending to the marketplace to give public lectures and firing off impassioned treatises and tractates in refutation of those contemporary thinkers whom he thought wrong-headed. When he took up his pen, he worked furiously, frenziedly, and almost unbelievably quickly. The 17,000 words of his hymn to Cybele were, he tells us, written in a single night. Unfortunately, it reads like it. Julian's style is diffuse, undisciplined, and oddly self-indulgent. All those same faults that he most deplored, ironically, in Roman society, and that were most conspicuously absent from his own daily life. His writing style, though, might have found favor among some of the woolier of the Neoplatonists whom he admired, but that would have cut little ice with, say, Socrates or Aristotle. No matter. He wrote as he earnestly believed under divine guidance. The gods were always with him, inspiring his tongue, directing his pen, forever ready with a sign of encouragement or warning to lead him in the path of righteousness and truth. Never, one suspects, never for a single second did he bethink himself that he might be wrong, or that the old religion might not, after all, prevail. Julian the Apostate did not seem to understand, though, that one simply could not turn back the clock to the way things were before the age of Constantine by fiat, and that there were certain elements of Christianity that had made it more attractive than paganism. And he tried to deduce what these things were. There's a very interesting document called A Letter to a Priest, which is in one of the 3 volumes of Loeb writings of Julian, where he basically says, he was giving directions to a priest, and he says, you have to be better about charity, and you have to take care of giving food to the poor, because the Christians do this and they win a lot of favor among the pagans. They take care of the pagans than we do. And there was a big plague in 362. And he was he very freely talked about this with these pagan priests, that, the Christians are going out there risking their own lives, not caring if they get sick, so as to help other people. Pagans have to be more like that. And in general, he designed various policies that were intended to move people away from Christianity and to make paganism more attractive than it had ever been before. He would employ for this purpose the classic carrot and stick method. The carrot would be changes to paganism that would make it more agreeable as a religion, and the stick would be various punishments that would be applied to Christians, so that Christianity, while not illegal, would at least be a very uncomfortable religion to espouse openly within Julian's empire. As for the carrots that Julian tried to create to make paganism more like Christianity, Julian understood that the ecclesiastical organization of Christianity was one of its great strengths. The fact that there was a hierarchy of local congregations headed by priests, and then above those priests were bishops who supervised the local congregations and maintained order in dioceses. And that this hierarchy had allowed Christian churches to withstand persecutions and to shift resources from one congregation to another when they were desperately in need. Paganism had none of that. There never had been any sort of hierarchy in paganism. Even pagan priests were part-timers. There was never like a full-time clergy the way that there is in Christianity. A pagan priest would perform his ceremonies and then go back to his job as being a magistrate or a soldier or whatever the case may be. There was certainly nothing like a pagan bishop, it was radically decentralized. Julian, therefore, drew up plans for inventing a whole new pagan church that operated in imitation of the Christian church. Pagan priests were to be full-time from now on, and they were to be devoted exclusively to their religious functions. There were to be pagan bishops, just like Christian bishops, who would maintain order and discipline and assist those local pagan congregations that needed it. It was an ambitious plan, but given the financial resources that it would have required, given the fact that Julian the Apostate ruled for only 2 years, coming to the imperial throne in 361 and dying in 363, the whole plan for a new pagan church never came to fruition. And of course, I might just add that this is totally absurd. There's nothing, you cannot just take a totally, you see, this is the fact that he even dreamed of doing this kind of stuff shows that he being raised in Christianity, he understood how the church works, and he wanted to just kind of superimpose that upon paganism. That doesn't work. Okay, it's the same kind of thing that one of these atheists I mentioned a moment ago, Daniel Dennett, he talks about in some of his writings and speeches, where that the modern atheists should take all the good works, all the beautiful sacred art, and desacralize it, of course, but all that great stuff that comes from Christianity, charity and food, soup kitchens, and all of that, but just get rid of all that metaphysical nonsense. But they don't understand, and neither did Julian, that the organization of the church, the whole purpose of having bishops and even having everything in the church is all of one singular piece together. You don't get the fruit without the tree. And to just take it and superimpose it upon paganism is like trying to put together fire and water. It's not going to work. Indeed, even Julian's own kind of insistent, always praying and looking for guidance and the inner voice. This too is basically, he's taking qualities of Christianity and trying to superimpose them onto paganism. Paganism never had the kind of interiority that Christianity has. The idea that, of having a personal relationship with God. Nobody had a personal relationship with Zeus. It was purely Julian's own kind of creation that you could somehow transfer that over from Christianity to the worship of the Olympian gods. So this is one of his fundamental kind of characteristics, and it's so wrong-headed. But another one of Julian's ideas for stealing the thunder of Christianity and adopting what he saw as best of Christianity and absorbing it into paganism involved philanthropy and charity. Now, as we mentioned many times, Roman paganism had a strong philanthropic emphasis, as did Christianity. But Roman philanthropy and Christian charity are very different things. Roman philanthropy was very much geared towards entertainment and often took the form of circuses, baths, aqueducts, gladiator shows, these public festivals where the meats were distributed, things that did not really help people very much, but might amuse them for a while and kind of aggrandize the person who was doing them. Philanthropy in Roman paganism was an obligation that fell only on the rich. If you had a lot of money, then you were expected to put on the gladiator shows or to build up aqueducts for your hometown. But if you were poor, then you were simply supposed to receive philanthropy and benefits from the largesse of your social superiors. Roman philanthropy was also openly and unabashedly self-serving. You didn't build circuses so much to help the people who were going to attend the animal fights. You did it in order to glorify yourself and to bring honor to your name. And that's why you would always have your name placed in huge letters and an inscription on any building that you ever constructed. And we have just absolutely loads of inscriptions just like this from the ancient world. Christian charity, by contrast, was different in virtually every respect. The obligation to give falls on every member of the Christian community. No matter how little or how much you have, this is something that every Christian must do. Moreover, Christian charity was geared more towards financial assistance to the destitute than to the entertainment of the mob. You were supposed to help orphans and widows, people who had suffered some form of calamity, people who could not provide for themselves. It was something that a person was not supposed to do, at least theoretically, out of love of personal glory, but is rather something to be done because it was spiritually meritorious. You did this because it was God's will for you. And indeed, this is yet another aspect of, even in our modern day post-Christian West, it is the Western countries that give so much more, incomparably more, in charity and in global initiatives than any other region on the face of the earth, including the very rich countries of the rest of the world. Whenever there's a huge catastrophe, whenever there's a earthquake in Pakistan or something like that, and thousands of people are stranded and without food and whatever, the response from the non-Western world is a big yawn, basically, even from the rich countries. China, Saudi Arabia never give anything like what we do. But every time there's some big calamity like that, it is always America, European countries, Australia, Canada, that immediately spring to action and raise money and send over troops to help distribute food and do whatever medical stuff. The Ebola doctors in Africa always come from the West. And why is this? Why is it that they never come from these other countries, even the rich ones? The answer is plain. It is an inheritance from our Christian culture, that the basic principle, if you can help, then you must help. Even though we may have forgotten the reason for why we believe that, it nevertheless comes from Christianity, because the West before Christianity didn't do that. Okay, the Romans and the Greeks and some the German barbarians, the Celts and stuff like that, they did not operate on that kind of system at all. So Julian understood that some pagans, at least, found Christian charity to be superior, morally superior, and more attractive than pagan philanthropy. He therefore envisioned adopting this form of charity for paganism, making pagan churches and temples responsible for taking care of poorer members of their congregation, the orphans and widows, for instance. He envisioned having the pagan priests also supervise the distribution of this charity to those who were most in need. And he talks about it in this letter to a pagan priest. You can find it online very easily. I'll send a link to it. But given his inability to create a sort of pagan church structure, one modeled after the Christian church, this sort of neo-pagan charity never came into being, and it merely remained a kind of fever dream of Julian's. Moreover, the carrots in all these capacities never came into existence. The sticks, however, did come into existence. But again, because Julian's career was so short-lived, they never really took on. But he was able to affect them during the time that he was in power. So although he did not outlaw Christianity, and indeed he made legal various forms of Christianity that had been outlawed before him, as I've mentioned, Julian did withdraw state financial support from Christian churches, and instead redirected it to where it had once gone, that is, to pagan temples, which he opened throughout the empire, and refurbished and all of that. His arguments on behalf of this policy were somewhat cynical. Christian bishops and other Christian leaders protested to Julian that he had turned off their financial spigot, essentially, on them, and in some cases even went so far as to confiscate Christian property and hand it over to pagan temples. Well, to these complaints, Julian stated very cynically that he was that he was acting justly, because while he was not a Christian, he knew that in the Christian Gospels it was said that it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And therefore, Julian didn't understand what all the protests were about, because he was simply doing them a favor. By relieving you of your burden of these riches, I'm actually increasing the chances of your personal salvation. Therefore, I don't see what all the fuss is about. It is a cute reply, but certainly a very cynical one, and not one that won him many Christian friends. Julian, as I said before, did not execute many Christians, but he definitely did execute some. A few army officers, for instance, who refused to take Christian symbols off of their gear were executed by Julian. But conversely, he was willing to look the other way when pagan mobs attacked Christians within the empire. And indeed, the 2 years of Julian's reign were rather chaotic, as pagan mobs and Christian mobs battled it out in the streets of cities throughout the Roman Empire. Clearly, the pagans were given now kind of a rush of blood to the head, kind of, we's the new normies now. And they took it out, took it as a chance to lord it over their Christian counterparts. In one notorious incident, a pagan mob in Alexandria, the most important city in Egypt, lynched the Christian bishop there, killing him. Julian punished this mob with a reprimand, which was perhaps the least formidable form of punishment that he could have possibly employed, simply, literally a verbal warning, don't do that again. However, when Christian mobs lynched local pagan officials, Julian did more than reprimand them. He confiscated their property, he imprisoned them, and even put some of them to death. So there is this unequal application of justice, lightly punishing pagans for killing Christian officials, but severely punishing Christians. And this is in a form of persecution in itself. On the flip side of things, that is, of trying to reinvigorate the old religion, it appeared that it was in no hurry to do so. In the summer of 362, for instance, Julian transferred his capital to Antioch in preparation for the Persian expedition that he was preparing for the following year. And as he marched through the heartland of Asia Minor, covering the 700 miles in something like 6 weeks, he was concerned to note that the Christian communities, having overcome their initial fears that the emperor might institute a new wave of persecutions, had settled down as before and were showing no sign whatsoever of tearing each other to bits. Nor were the pagans, who represented an almost infinite variety of beliefs, from the primitive animism of the peasantry to the arcane mysteries evolved by the Neoplatonist intellectuals, nor were they noticeably stronger or more cohesive than in Constantine's day. In vain, therefore, did Julian journey from one temple to another, personally officiating at one animal sacrifice after another until he was nicknamed the Butcher by his subjects. In vain, also, did he try to impose upon his fellow pagans an organized priesthood with its own hierarchy on the Christian model, urging them to establish hospitals and orphanages, even monasteries and convents, can you imagine, in order that, as it were, they might beat the Christians at their own game. The prevailing apathy was unshakable. Ruefully, Julian himself told the local citizens a story of his visit to the great festival of Apollo, held annually at Daphne, the rich residential suburb of Antioch, in these words: "I hurried there from the temple of Zeus Cassius, believing that at Daphne, if anywhere, I should enjoy the sight of your wealth and public spirit. And like a man seeing visions in a dream, I pictured to myself what a procession it would be, the beasts for the sacrifice, the libations, the choruses in honor of the god, the incense, and the youth of your city gathered about the sacred precinct, their souls dressed in reverence, and they themselves clothed in white raiment. But when I entered the shrine, I found neither incense, nor barley cake, nor a single beast for sacrifice. And when I inquired what sacrifice the city proposed to offer to celebrate the annual festival of the god, the priest answered, I have brought from my own house a goose as an offering. But the city has so far made no preparations." Well, if the pagans could not be galvanized into life, there was no alternative but to increase pressure on the Christians. And so, on the 17th of June, 362, Julian published an edict which, innocuous though it appeared at first sight, struck a body blow at the Christian faith. It turned out to be Julian's most controversial policy, and one which will probably appear surprising to most of you listening to this. It wasn't the decision to grow a beard, and it wasn't his unequal application of the norms of justice. Rather, his most controversial action involved education. Julian wanted to win back everybody to paganism, but he especially wanted to maintain his base, as we would say today, and to keep the kind of literate classes, the educated classes, from slipping into Christianity. And as indeed they were starting to do during the course of the fourth century. Therefore, in 362, Julian forbade Christians from teaching Greek literature within the Roman Empire. Pagans were to teach pagan works. Christians could teach their own scriptures in schools if they chose. For any school teacher, he declared, the first and most important requirement was an irreproachable moral character. In consequence, no teacher would thenceforth be permitted to follow his calling without first obtaining the approval of his local city council and through that of the emperor himself. In an explanatory circular, Julian made it clear that, in his view, no Christian who professed to teach the classical authors, who in those days occupied virtually all of the school curriculum, no Christian teacher could possibly be of this required moral standard, since that teacher would be teaching subjects in which he himself did not believe. Therefore, that teacher must subsequently either abjure his faith or his livelihood. So on its surface, this may seem a needling and seemingly innocuous prohibition, but in fact, Christian contemporaries understood the profound implications of this particular imperial edict. Because, as I said, the classical literature was at the heart of Roman education, Greco-Roman education, the educational systems through which all Roman aristocrats, senatorial class, equestrian class, all the literate classes were supposed to pass. If you forbade Christians from teaching Greek literature, by Greek I mean pagan literature, then you were simply going to drive Christians from the teaching profession entirely. And as a result, you would have only pagan teachers like the ones that Julian himself had had as a youth, pagan teachers who had brought Julian, that is, back into paganism. It was Julian's hope then that by revamping the educational system and forbidding Christians from teaching Greek literature, he could subject the Roman senators to pagan teaching. Not just the Roman senatorial class, but all of the literate classes of Rome to pagan teaching. Perhaps they would experience a conversion, much like the one he had earlier in his life, and they would come back to paganism. This edict, therefore, was and has been denounced by Christian writers down from the ages as one of the most heinous of Julian's crimes against the church. And interestingly enough, even in his own day, the pagan Ammianus Marcellinus, who admired so much about Julian, considered that, quote, it deserved to be buried in eternal silence, end quote. And of course, we might, the comparison with modern day times is obvious in some ways, right? Why is it that there's such a huge debate going on right now about critical race theory and the teaching of transgender ideology in the schools, and why so many people are so up in arms about that right now? And there are really two very distinct, sides on this issue. It really has to do with what Andrew Breitbart, the founder of Breitbart Media, once said, that politics is downstream from culture. And we might go further than that and say culture is downstream from religion. Okay. In fact, the very word cultura, culture, comes ultimately from cultus, what you worship. Okay. Your culture derives from what you believe. And this is all differences basically are theological in their root. All cultural and ideological differences are ultimately theological. And so this is very much kind of like that in Julian's time. Well, in the long term, because of Julian's relatively short lifespan, all of his attempts to revamp the education system came to nothing. So that's the short version of that. But the effects of it in the immediate aftermath of his edict in 362 were felt far beyond the academic world. Christian demonstrations were held in protest, and there were riots often when, on discovering that, say, a temple of Apollo and Daphne, the one he just talked about with the goose, had been defiled by the burial within its precincts of a Christian martyr, the emperor ordered the exhumation of those holy relics and that they be removed. On this particular occasion, several of the demonstrators who were protesting this act of the emperor were arrested, and they were later released, though only after at least one of them had been put to torture. And on the 26th of October in 362, the whole temple was burnt down to the ground. Well, Julian retaliated by closing down the great church of Antioch, which was nearby, and confiscated all of its gold plate on the inside, all of the vessels and communion chalices and other implements and utensils. Tensions now were rising fast. Further incidents followed, and as the situation began to escalate, more than one Christian courted and achieved martyrdom. There were, to be sure, no all out-and-out persecutions of the kind that had been seen under Decius or Diocletian, But Julian, whose emotional stability was a good deal more uncertain than either of theirs, would have been fully willing to institute such persecutions, no doubt, had he thought them necessary. And I'm just going to jump to a point that we will talk about later on after this kind of narrative. And that is one of the big kind of questions that many scholars have wondered about Julian. Would he have instituted empire-wide edicts of persecution, like Decius and Diocletian had done? And the answer to me is absolutely yes. He was absolutely of that. His hatred for Christianity and his disdain for the miserable Galileans, as he calls Christians in his writings again and again and again, leave one, and of course his actions that I've outlined for you right now, all of that leaves no doubt in my mind that that's precisely what he would have done had he lived longer. And therefore it was a blessed day for the Christians when on the 5th of March, 363, Julian set off for the east at the head of some 90,000 men, never to return alive. He went off in the east to go and bring war to the Persians. The Persian Empire, of course, and the Roman Empire had been fighting along their common frontier with occasional deep inroads into each other's territories for the best part of 2.5 centuries by this point. In 298, the colleague of the Caesar of Augustus of Diocletian, Galerius, had actually won a great victory over King Narses, and this had theoretically ensured 40 years of peace in the treaty that they signed afterwards. But in 363, Narses' second successor, Shapur II, had decided to take his revenge. Shapur was at the time 54 years old and had occupied the Persian throne for the same period. Technically, actually, even a little longer than 54 years, since he is perhaps the only monarch in all history to have been crowned in utero. I cannot help but now quote Gibbon. The wife of Hormuz remained pregnant at the time of her husband's death, and the uncertainty of the sex as well as of the event excited the ambitious hopes of the princes of the house of Sasan. This is the Sassanid dynasty. The apprehensions of civil war were at length removed by the positive assurance of the Magi that the widow of Hormuz had conceived and would safely produce a son. Obedient to the voice of superstition, the Persians prepared without delay the ceremony of his coronation. A royal bed on which the queen lay in state was exhibited in the midst of the palace. The diadem was placed on the spot which might be supposed to conceal the future heir of Artaxerxes, and the prostrate satraps adored the majesty of their invisible and insensible sovereign. Such wonderful writing from Gibbon. Well, it had been unfortunate for Constantius that for much of the 350s, when he had been busy in Gaul with the revolt of one Magnentius, who you see in front of you now, and who, although was a pagan, nevertheless actually put the Chi Rho and Alpha and Omega on his coinage, as you can see, to kind of, put himself in line of legitimation with the house of Constantine. Nevertheless, in the aftermath of that revolt, Shapur too had been occupied elsewhere. For the rest of Shapur's reign, however, both before and after this period, for the rest of Constantius's reign, both before and after this period, the Persian king Shapur had caused Constantius almost constant anxiety. The climax came in 359, when after a prolonged siege, Shapur captured the key fortress of Amida, the present Turkish city of Diyarbakir, which controlled both the headwaters of the Tigris River and the approaches to Asia Minor from the east, and went on from there up to a dangerously strong position in Upper Mesopotamia. By now, therefore, a major Roman offensive was essential in the situation, if the situation were not to get seriously out of hand. And Julian, conscious as he was of following in the footsteps of Pompey, Trajan, and Septimius Severus, and even, there is reason to suspect, believing that he might be kind of the newest installment, newest kind of reiteration of Alexander the Great himself, he was impatient to achieve similar glory. Well, his road ran first of all due east by way of Beroia, the modern Aleppo. in Syria, where he slaughtered a white bull, of course, on the Acropolis as a tribute to Zeus. At Hierapolis, he wheeled slightly to the north, crossing the Euphrates and the present Syrian-Turkish frontier, possibly to perform a further sacrifice at the great temple of the moon at Karai, now Haran. From here, he followed the flow of the rivers first to Belek, as far as Raqqa, and then the Euphrates itself to the point just south of Baghdad, where it comes to within some 30 miles of the Tigris, and where the army was able to take one of the several minor waterways linking the two. Therefore, after a few minor sieges and skirmishes, but no real difficulties, Julian found himself on the west bank of the Tigris, gazing up at the walls of Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, now a most spectacular ruin, some 20 miles southeast of Baghdad. On the opposite shore, however, occupying the land between those walls and the river, was a Persian army, already drawn up and ready for battle. And the Roman generals were concerned to note that it numbered, besides the normal cavalry, a quantity of elephants, always a powerful weapon, not just because their men had, at this point, no experience in dealing with them, but because their smell terrified the horses to the point of panic. Nonetheless, Julian gave the order to advance across the river. The first attempt to land on the further bank was repulsed, but the second, with the whole weight of the army behind it, succeeded, and battle was joined. It ended, to the surprise of many on both sides, in an overwhelming victory for Roman arms. According to Ammianus, who was there and who took part in the fighting, 2,500 Persians were killed at the cost of a mere 70 Roman lives. The date was the 29th of May. Already by the next day, however, suddenly and without warning, the situation had changed. Doubt and uncertainty spread over the Roman camp. Within the space of a week, the siege of Ctesiphon was abandoned almost before it had begun, and the army was thinking only of retreat. What had happened? There was much talk among Julian's apologists about Persian skullduggery, and it may well have been a trick of some kind that led him to order the burning of his considerable river fleet, though now how much good this would have been to him on his return journey upstream is an open question. Nevertheless, the most likely explanation, and the one given by Ammianus Marcellinus, who would know, was that the emperor had at last been brought face to face with military realities. Ctesiphon was virtually impregnable, and Shapur's main army, larger by far than that which he had just defeated, was rapidly approaching. And there was another problem, too. Despite the recent victory, morale in the Roman army was dangerously low. Food was short. The Persians had pursued a scorched earth policy for miles around and didn't leave anything for the Romans to gather in. The Romans were all in flood. The rivers were all in flood, with the result that the men were floundering from one quagmire to the next. The heat was murderous, and the flies, Ammianus tells us, were so thick that they blotted out the light of the sun. Julian, Ammianus goes on, was still in favor of advancing further into Persian territory, but his generals refused. Even had they themselves been willing, they knew that they could never have persuaded their men to follow. And therefore, on the 16th of June, the retreat began. Continually, remorselessly harried by the Persian cavalry, the army trudged back to the northwest along the left bank of the Tigris. And then on the 26th of June, when it had reached a point a short distance downstream from Samarra, it suddenly came under heavy attack. Once again, the dreaded elephants were brought into action, and once again the air was thick with spears and arrows. Without pausing to strap on his breastplate, Julian plunged into the thick of the fray, shouting encouragement to his men as he fought in their midst. And just as the tide of battle was turning and the Persians were beginning to retreat, a flying spear struck Julian in the side. Trying to pull it out, he succeeded only in severing the sinews in his right hand. Meanwhile, those nearest him lifted him from the ground where he had fallen and carried him to his tent. The spear was extracted from deep in his liver, but the damage was done. He died just before midnight. According to tradition, Julian had scooped up a handful of the blood that was flowing from his wound and exclaimed the words, Nenikekas me, Galilee. Thou hast conquered me, O Galilean. In other words, he was speaking to Christ and saying, you won. The church tradition is that he was slain by Saint Mercurius, who you see a Coptic icon of him, an Arabic icon of him in front of you. Saint Mercurius was a Roman soldier who had been martyred under the persecutions. Actually had one of the officers that had been martyred under Julian. The tradition is that Saint Basil the Great, who we're going to be learning all about in our next lecture, was at this time praying before an icon of Saint Mercurius, and that he would deliver the church from the scourge of Julian. And at that moment, the image of Saint Mercurius disappeared from the icon, and then reappeared later on with his spear bloodied. And this is what is depicted before you right now in this icon. Interestingly, there were Christian authors who claimed that it was a Christian who killed Julian. No doubt they wanted to lay claim to the credit of offing the last pagan emperor in the West. Pagan authors who did not want to perhaps give Christians the satisfaction of having done that to their guy, claimed that he had simply died in battle against the Persians. It was a Persian who killed him, or at the very least a pagan member of his own army with tremendously bad aim. Regardless of who actually killed Julian the Apostate, though, the fact for the army was that he was now dead. He was only 31 years old at the time of his death, and his death in Mesopotamia on that day, June 26th of 363, was a fateful event. That evening, the senior officers met in the imperial tent. The emperor was dying, and initially the officers turned to the praetorian prefect, a man named Salutius, a senior pagan respected by all members of the army, who had been with Julian from the start, and they asked him, would you become emperor? Salutius turned it down on the grounds of his age. Also, he didn't want the job of taking a Roman army out of Persia back into Rome. It was a pretty chancy job description. And so then they next turned to a Christian, a Nicene Orthodox Christian named Jovian, who was second in command. And they asked Jovian, would you take up the emperorship? And Jovian was nervous, and he said, you know, I am a Christian, and the emperor was a pagan. And the other officers said to Jovian, tonight in this tent, we're all Christians. Get us out of Persia. In other words, they were not really concerned about religious differences at this moment. The point was they needed somebody who could get them out of there. Well, Jovian accepted this most difficult burden of office, and he signed an ignominious peace treaty where he gave up strategic provinces in the east, but he did get the army back to the Roman Empire in safety. And as a result, Julian the Apostate would be the last pagan Roman emperor in the Roman Empire. That is, every emperor after him in Rome would be a Christian. Julian's various measures, the ones that had come into existence during the 2 years of his reign, were repealed after his death, although some were repealed more quickly than others. State support was restored very quickly to Christian churches and withdrawn from pagan temples. The restriction of the teaching of pagan literature by Christians was repealed almost right away. And that altar of victory, you remember, that I began with tonight, was restored to its place in deep storage, yanked out of the Roman Senate house by an emperor named Gratian, who would rule from 375 to 383, again, despite the protests of pagan senators. But the story actually doesn't even end there, and we'll be hearing much more about that altar in a later lecture. However, Julian's orders that pagan worship be permitted publicly again were not repealed right away. This is interesting. It took a little while for Christian emperors to undo that particular aspect of the reign of the apostate. The emperor responsible for this was Theodosius I, who was the last Roman emperor to rule over the west and east simultaneously. Ruling from 378 to 395, Theodosius I would actually take the final step towards the elimination of any legal recognition of paganism, at least any public forms of paganism, any public worship of in paganism. We will study him, though, in much more detail also in a subsequent lecture. Julian's campaign, it must be said, was disastrous for the pagan cause. The pagans had lost their emperor. Despite all of his piety to restore the worship of the gods, he had failed spectacularly. He was the first emperor since Valerian back in 260 to suffer an ignominious death on the battlefield, or at least at enemy hands. To the Christians, therefore, this was a vindication of their faith, and it was a way for the Christians to draw a parallel between Julian fighting under the old gods and being defeated thereby through a Persian foe, and on the other hand, Constantine and Constantius, who won brilliant victories under the labarum, the symbol of Christ. The death of Julian meant the end of his reforms, but it was more than that. The pagans now were disorganized, demoralized. They didn't have leadership. With the death of Julian, a very important turning point, therefore, was made. And the Christians would assume the cultural and political dominance that the pagans had formerly held in the Roman world. Within the next generation, the second turning point, as I just intimated a moment ago, would come with the Emperor Theodosius I. Now, I want to give some more analysis of the reign of Julian, because it is worthy of study. As I said, Julian was only 31 at the time of his death and had occupied the imperial throne for just 19 and a half months. One of the big questions is, what would he have done if he had ruled for more time? And there's no doubt, as I said before, in my mind, that he would have instigated all-out hot persecutions against Christians. If he returned, say, victorious from paganism, from Persia, bearing, if he had won in Persia under pagan banners, as we can see, look, the very night of his death, the emperorship almost went to a pagan, but he did not accept it. That is obviously a big counterfactual, but again, it underscores the point that I began with tonight, that from the point of view of simple human historical contingency, the conversion of Rome to Christianity on an official level was not at all an inevitable situation. It was clearly something that is very special, and something that that simply by the lights of human wisdom could have gone a different way. But as an emperor, Julian was a failure. He was responsible for no lasting legislation. He wasted his time and energy on hopelessly quixotic attempts to revive this ill-defined and moribund paganism, to the detriment of that which was to give the empire its binding force for 1,000 years to come: Christianity. He had made himself thoroughly unpopular with his subjects, both Christian and pagan alike, and that is really one of the very very interesting features about him, which I will return to in a moment. Many of his pagan contemporaries actually disliked his Puritanism and his ceaseless sermonizing, and he came near to destroying the entire imperial army as well as himself in a campaign which, however well organized it was on the chalkboard, almost ended in near catastrophe through want of clear-sighted forward planning and properly focused objectives. And yet, out of all the emperors of late antiquity, certainly the 88 emperors of Byzantium, it is Julian, more so than any other, excepting the great Constantine himself, who has caught the imagination of posterity, from Gregory the theologian, as I quoted earlier on, in the 4th century, to Gore Vidal in the 20th century. Julian has been depicted by medieval writers as a devil, a serpent, as a type of antichrist. And in the Renaissance, he was seen as a tragic hero. And by those in the 18th century, he was looked at as a kind of archetypal philosopher prince, an apostle of reason and enlightenment. And the Romantics in the 19th century looked at him in their favorite guise of outsider and rebel, noble, courageous, but ultimately doomed to defeat. It is arguable that this last interpretation, even when, as has several times occurred, Julian's life is embellished with the love interest which in history it had so conspicuously lacked, perhaps comes nearest to the truth. Few monarchs have possessed his most outstanding qualities in such abundance: his intelligence, the depth of his education and culture, his energy and tireless industry, the courage and inspiring leadership that he invariably showed in battle, the utter integrity and incorruptibility of his public and private life, his apparent immunity to physical temptation of whatever kind, his astonishing ability to sublimate himself in the service of his empire and above all of his gods. But he also possessed faults, which together made any lasting achievement impossible. The first was clearly his fanaticism, which warped his judgment and robbed him of that instinctive sense of priorities, which was essential to any successful ruler. The second was a certain lack of sharpness and definition in his thinking. This latter trait was all too evident in his literary effusions, which, if you ever read them, you'll see exactly what I mean. And in his own thinking, this problem would be ultimately to sabotage his Persian expedition. And one may well derive from the other. His fanaticism, that is, I think, feeds into his effusive, ill-defined way of thinking. Julian could, on occasion, be curiously indecisive. Yet, on the other hand, this very weakness gave him, once he had resolved upon his actions, an extraordinary self-confidence, a kind of sense of divine mission. And even when it was plain to all that a disastrous mistake had been made, his courage never deserted him, because, after all, he felt he had the gods on his side. Had he lived, perhaps he would have overcome some of these faults and proved himself to be a better emperor than he was. But he did not live. He died in the most characteristic way he could have died, bravely but unnecessarily, leaving the world with nothing but the ineffaceable memory of a remarkable yet misguided young visionary who attempted to change the world and failed. His talents and high qualities totally left betrayed and fruitless. Now, I want to return to a point that I mentioned just now. It comes as no surprise that Christians dislike Julian intensely, but it is surprising that many pagans did not like Julian either. In fact, very few people liked Julian during his lifetime. And in part, this was simple self-interest. By the early 360s, Christian emperors had been around now for multiple generations. Coming out and announcing one's paganism, supporting Julian the Apostate, might prove to be a bad career move if, say, the next emperor turned out to be a Christian. Some had adopted the policy of sort of laying low and seeing how things would turn out. And certainly some of the opposition to Julian, the active opposition, came from pagans themselves, in part because of Julian's own personality. He was irritating as an individual on many levels. Well-educated pagan senators and philosophers found Julian rather ostentatious, distasteful. The beard was silly, and he had this tremendous devotion to animal sacrifice, which senators saw as, just going way beyond what was fitting, and indeed could be seen as just kind of pandering to the crowd, maybe. If I were to venture to use such an imprecise phrase, your average pagan in the street found Julian and his attempts to write philosophical discourses and restore intellectual vitality to paganism incomprehensible, not to say ludicrous. And as a result, Julian found himself with relatively few supporters within the empire. And he understood that without broader popular support, none of his plans could possibly amount to anything. His decision to invade the Persian Empire may have been calculated with precisely this view in mind, of galvanizing popularity through what was no doubt the quickest route in Roman culture to popularity, namely military glory. He may well have thought that if he could win a noteworthy triumph over an old enemy of the Roman Empire, perhaps this would give him the moral force he needed to begin his ambition to reconstitute paganism. After all, he had had some expectation of success. He had been a successful military commander in Gaul in the 350s, and to launch his invasion of the Persian Empire, Julian had amassed one of the largest armies in Roman history and invaded the Persian Empire in 363. His invasion of the Persian Empire, moreover, proved to be a fiasco, and he spent much of his time simply meandering around Mesopotamia, low on supplies, and his military encounters with the Persians went very badly, the nadir of which was the minor skirmish in which he himself was struck by a spear and killed. So you put it all together, some contemporaries would have definitely seen now a second pagan emperor has been killed by an enemy, and that is just the sort of thing that pagans would have been acutely mindful of. Remember, defeat in battle was always kind of one of those things that was seen in the pagan worldview as being kind of a punishment from the gods, and especially when it was to be in contrast with the previous reigns of Constantine and his sons, who had such brilliant military victories. So we see this a lot in some of the Christian reaction to Julian afterwards. One of the Christian writers who writes a lot about these things is Saint Ephrem the Syrian, whose dates are from 306 to 373 AD, who is a father of the church. He is unique among the fathers of the church as being the only deacon who is considered to be a father of the church. That is, one of the great teachers and writers of the early church who codifies Christian doctrine. All the rest were either priests or bishops, most often bishops. He was the only deacon. Well, one of the things that what Ephrem did was, well, Ephrem was living, as you can see from his title, he was living in the East. He was a Syrian. He wrote in Syriac, the demotic form of the literary form of the Aramaic language. He was Semitic, therefore. And until the year 363, St. Ephrem was a teacher and hymnographer for the church in Nisibis in the Far East. But then after Jovian took over in the death of Julian, all of those territories in the east were ceded to the Persian Empire. So you have Nisibis, and it is now, see, it's right over here. Now all of a sudden it finds itself, the borders have been redrawn, and now all of this area falls under the reign of the Persians, who were also persecutors of Christians. So you have a lot of refugees, basically, and Saint Ephrem was one of them. He and his fellow Christians from Nisibis made a long march over into the west into the city of Edessa over here. And he wrote four, in fact, hymns against the Emperor Julian. And they all have obviously a theological content, but they have this kind of, they really express certain kinds of what the ideology of the Christians was vis-a-vis Julian and his contrast with the previous emperors Constantine and Constantius. As I said, specifically, there are four hymns against Emperor Julian and another hymn on the church that was composed before Julian died, in anticipation, in fact, of the apostate's arrival in Nisibis soon after his accession to the throne. And I just want to give you something of an indication of what this latter poem, the one on the church, is about. From the beginning of this hymn, St. Ephrem sets forth his central theological theme. There is no reason to fear that God has abandoned his church. Obviously, this was a fear that many Christians had. Think about it. Now, all of a sudden, you think about the triumphalism that one sees in the history of Eusebius, the tremendous sense of victory that after such a long period of time, 300 years, Christians had been persecuted by the Romans, and things were so bad under the Diocletian and the other tetrarchs. And now all of a sudden, an absolute miracle takes place where Constantine converts, legalizes Christianity, and everything starts blossoming. And that goes on for several decades. And now all of a sudden, you know, in 363, a full 50 years after the Edict of Milan, there seems to be this dramatic reversion where everything seemed to be going so much in a straight line, and then all of a sudden you have everything going backwards. Obviously, many Christians must have felt that God had abandoned them, and so Ephraim takes up his pen to explain, no, that is not how we should interpret this event. There is no reason to fear that God has abandoned his church. The true Christian must not lose hope, but persevere under conditions of duress. Saint Ephraim, who because of his Semitic background is always very, very at home in the Old Testament. He uses the examples of prophets Elijah and Daniel to show that the courage to rebuke idolatrous tyrants is required of us by our Creator, and that we will be vindicated for it, that this has happened before in sacred history. And he gives these examples from the Old Testament of bad kings that have taken over, but the faithful stand in rebuke of them. The hymn is particularly rich in vineyard imagery. The present time is a transitory period of trial in which the true fruits will cling to the true vine. The incarnation itself is symbolic of the fact that God does not ever forget us, for Christ, the true vine, bent down to rescue us. The present time is a transitory period of trial in which the true fruits will cling to the true vine while the wild grapes are cast away. Now that the plenitude of summer has been replaced by winter, true Christians will continue to love the vine dresser. You see, it's so much easier, of course. You have all these fair weather Christians flocking to convert after the time of Constantine, perhaps seeing, oh, this is now a way to not entirely like this, but I'm sure that there were some people who saw this as being a kind of smart move, they saw which way the winds were blowing. But now, though, the true Christians will have a chance to be revealed, just like our friends. The fair weather friend is somebody who won't be there when the difficulties come. And this time of difficulty shows who the true faithful are. And looked at from another way, now that the refreshing shade of the Christian emperors has been withdrawn to make us mindful of our drought, we have an opportunity to show fidelity and perseverance. This is when our true faith can really shine forth. His hymns are very beautiful, and I will send you a link so you can read some of them on your own if you so choose. I just want to conclude now with something in an entirely different direction, and that is one final pagan author named Sallustius, who was a personal friend of the pagan emperor Julian, and he was very influenced by Neoplatonism, as indeed Julian was too, and who sets about to codify in this work this one surviving work of his on the gods and the cosmos. He sets about to codify the kind of Neoplatonic reinterpretation of the traditional myths. Okay, now this is really fascinating because in some ways this is exactly the sort of mentality that Julian adopts. You see, Julian, because of his Christian upbringing, certainly could not countenance the sort of crass aspects of paganism, that one reads about in many of the traditional stories of Homer, say, or anything like that. And therefore, he feels compelled to reinterpret them in the light of a higher, kind of more intellectual guise. And of course, Neoplatonism was on hand to provide that. And we see this sort of reinterpretation of traditional paganism in the light of Greek philosophy, very well articulated by this 4th century writer Sallustius, who, as I said, we must remember was not only a contemporary, but actually a friend of Julian. So they would have talked, and they would have, we can take this to be quite a good explication. It's very much in harmony with the statements that Julian makes in his own writings. Let's just read some selections from it. First of all, even though one reads in the myths, say in the Iliad or the Odyssey or anything like that, Hesiod, that the gods come into being and, they are born in various different ways, right? One god gets together with another god and produces another god. that all, of course, is completely rejected by the Neoplatonic philosophers, who believe as an a priori principle that the gods are immutable, without generation, eternal, bodiless, and are not fixed in any place. And let's read what Celestius says about this. The essences of the gods are neither generated, for eternal natures are without generation. And those beings are eternal who possess a first power and are naturally void of passivity. Passivity would be a technical term here, meaning the ability to suffer. Now, of course, if you've read the Iliad or the Odyssey or any of these ancient myths, you'll know that the gods can actually suffer things. They certainly experience all the physical sensations. They eat and drink and sleep and fornicate, and even in I believe it's book 5 of the Iliad, when the warrior Diomedes actually attacks the goddess Aphrodite, who comes down to the battlefield, and he strikes her with his spear and makes her bleed. Of course, it's not blood, but ichor, this kind of substance that runs in the veins of the gods. So a very, very, how do you deal with that if you were a Neoplatonist? Well, you just basically say these myths they have to be interpreted somehow allegorically, not literally, because the gods in their essence do not have bodies. Look at that. For even the powers of bodies are incorporeal, nor are they comprehended in place, so that the gods are not limited to any one locality. For this is the property of bodies, nor are they separated from the first cause or from each other. In the same manner as intellections, that would be Plato's forms, are not separated from the intellect, nor sciences or knowledge from the soul. So we get a very different vision of the divine here. If you remember in book 5 of the Odyssey, if you've ever read that, the god Poseidon is all of a sudden comes back from receiving the sacrifices of the Ethiopians. He wasn't around for a while, and then all of a sudden he comes back and he finds that a guy he really doesn't like, namely Odysseus, has taken the opportunity, since he wasn't around, to escape from the island that he was being imprisoned on. And Poseidon basically has a hissy fit and makes a big storm because his will was being thwarted. So the gods of Greek myth were not looked at as being omnipotent, were not looked at as being omnipresent, omniscient, any of those kind of qualities. But now, under the influence of Neoplatonism, they are. So what do you make of that, Celestius? Well, he asked the same question. On what account, then, do the ancients, neglecting such discourses as these, employed myths? This is a question not unworthy of our investigation. Well, do tell. And this indeed is the first utility arising from the fables, that they excite us to inquiry and do not suffer our cognitive power to remain in indolent rest. So you see, the myths actually challenge us, says Celestius, because they're presenting the gods in a way contradictory to their real nature. So they force us to think about it. Do you buy that? He goes on, it will not be difficult, therefore, to show that fables, and by fables is simply the Latin word fabula, the Latin equivalent of mythos in Greek, that myths are divine from those by whom they are employed. For they are used by poets agitated by divinity. So, in other words, the poets were inspired. Look at that, a very, very different vision of the poets than had ever been believed before by pagans. There really was no idea in paganism of an inspired text, the way that the Bible and the authors of the Bible are envisioned as being inspired by Jews and Christians. By the best of philosophers and by such as disclose initiatory rites. In oracles also, fables are employed by the gods. But why fables are divine is the part of philosophy to investigate. Since, therefore, all beings rejoice in similitude and are averse from dissimilitude, it is necessary that discourses concerning the gods should be as similar to them as possible, that they may become worthy of their essence and that they may render the gods propitious to those who discourse concerning them, all which can be only effected by fables. Fables, therefore, imitate the gods according to effable and ineffable, that is, that which can be spoken and that which cannot be spoken, unapparent and apparent, wise and ignorant. And this likewise extends to the goodness of the gods, For as the gods impart the goods of sensible natures in common to all things, but the gods resulting from intelligibles to the wise alone, so fables assert to all men that there are gods. Okay, so the first message that the myths teach us is that the gods exist. Okay, and they teach this in lovely stories, entertaining stories that even a child could appreciate. So that seems to be his first point. But who they are and of what kind, they alone manifest to such as are capable of so exalted a knowledge. So there you go. So they teach the existence of themselves to everybody who reads myths, but they only reveal their true spiritual nature to those capable of this exalted knowledge. And of course, that would be the philosophers. In fables too, the energies of the gods are imitated, for the world may very well be called a fable, since bodies and the incorporeal possessions which it contains are apparent, but souls and intellects are occult, that is hidden and invisible. Besides, to inform all men of the truth concerning the gods produces contempt in the unwise, from their incapacity of learning and negligence in the studious. But concealing truth in fables prevents the contempt of the former, and compels the latter to philosophize. But you will ask why adulteries, thefts, paternal bonds, and other unworthy actions are celebrated in fables. Yes, that's a good question. Nor is this unworthy of admiration, that where there is an apparent absurdity, the soul, immediately conceiving these discourses to be concealments, may understand that the truth which they contain is to be involved in profound and hidden silence. So obviously he's taking great pains to try to explain why they have all these apparent difficulties in them. There are 5 types of myths. Some are theological, others physical, others animistic, that would be kind of psychological, belonging to the soul, others material, and lastly, others mixed from these. Fables are theological, which employ nothing corporeal, nothing bodily, but speculate the very essences of the gods, such as the fable which asserts that Saturn devoured his children. So that's, if you're familiar with this, this is mentioned in Hesiod. Saturn, or Kronos in Greek, had children, and then learning that one of his sons would overthrow him, decided to preempt that problem by eating all of his children. And according to Celestius, this obscurely intimates the nature of an intellectual God, since every intellect returns unto itself. Wow. So you see, what we might call metacognition, or thinking about your own thought process, Celestius says we can garner from the myth of Kronos or Saturn eating his own children. That is, the god kind of reflexively, consumes himself, consumes his own essence. So, I mean, this is, I'm sure you can form your own judgments about this, but clearly there's a lot of special pleading here. Okay, there's a great attempt, and this is really the point. There's a great attempt to try to intellectualize what would otherwise be just totally, stories that clearly are at variance with the high high-mindedness of Neoplatonic philosophy. But we speculate fables physically when we speak concerning the energies of the gods about the world, as when considering Saturn the same as time. See this, because in Greek, the name for Saturn is Kronos, and that sounds a lot like the word chronos, which means time. Etymologically, they're actually unrelated, if you can believe that. The kappa and the chi are actually 2 distinct letters, but their identification with one another is ubiquitous in ancient commentaries on this, of this type. Calling the parts of time the children of the universe, you see. So Kronos eats his own children because time, of course, devours all things. We assert that the children are devoured by their parents in the sense that the universe, everything in it is subject to decay. So again, a very, very kind of, we might even say ingenious way of trying to get around this. And he goes further. We employ myths in a kind of psychological mode when we contemplate the energies of the soul, because the intellections of our souls, though by a discursive energy they proceed into other things, yet abide in their parents. Lastly, fables are material, such as the Egyptians ignorantly employ, considering and calling corporeal natures divinities, such as Isis, earth, Osiris, humidity, Typhon, heat, or again, denominating Saturn, water, Adonis, fruits, and Bacchus, wine. And indeed, to assert that these are dedicated to the gods in the same manner as herbs, stones, and animals on the part of wise men. I'm sorry, is the part of wise men. But to call them gods is alone the province of madmen, unless we speak in the same manner as when from established custom we call the orb of the sun and its rays the sun itself. So part of the old kind of way of looking at paganism was to kind of view the sea and Poseidon as basically somehow two different modes of the same person. Grain was Ceres, the god, or Demeter in Greek. Bacchus was wine in some ways, but he, of course, says, no, that's totally crazy, unless we talk about sunlight and the sun itself as being this, both the same thing. It's just transposing the gift of something or the energy of something into the essence itself. But we may perceive the mixed kind of myths, as well as in many other particulars, as in the fable which relates that discord, this is the goddess Eris, at a banquet of the gods threw a golden apple, and that a dispute about it arose among the goddesses, and they were sent by Jupiter to take the judgment of Paris, who, charmed with the beauty of Venus, gave her the apple in preference to the rest. So this is the famous story of how the Trojan War began, that Eris was not invited to a wedding between Peleus and Thetis, and therefore threw a golden apple into the midst of the party with one word in the dative case written on it, Callista, to the most beautiful. And the goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all thought it was for them. And so they asked Paris, the most handsome mortal man, to decide which one of them was the most beautiful. And you probably know the story. They all offered him a bribe on the side. Hera said, I'll give you the rulership over many cities. And he was like, nah, I'm not interested in that. Athena said, I'll give you strength and courage in battle. And he said, no, I'm not really interested in that either. And Aphrodite said, I'll make the most beautiful woman in the world fall in love with you. And he said, okay, I choose you. And of course, that most beautiful woman was Helen of Troy, and the whole war started because of that, the face that launched 1,000 ships. Well, so what do you do with this kind of myth? Well, in this fable, the banquet denotes the supramundane powers of the gods. And on this account, they subsist in conjunction with each other. But the golden apple denotes the world, which on account of its composition from contrary natures is not improperly said to be thrown by discord or strife. So absolutely ingenious stuff here. It's all just allegorical. So all these myths are allegory of some deeper thing. But again, since different gifts are imparted to the world by different gods, they appear to contest with each other for the apple. And a soul living according to sense, for this is Paris, not perceiving other powers in the universe, asserts that the contended apple subsists alone through the beauty of Venus, Aphrodite. But of these species of fables, such as are theological, belong to philosophers. The physical and psychological rites, since the intention of all mystic ceremonies is to conjoin us with the world and the gods. So in other words, notice how this kind of Neoplatonic high-mindedness, or this kind of ingenious allegorizing of all these myths, is not at all in contradiction or at variance with the performance of the traditional rites of animal sacrifice. Okay, that's really important, that there was kind of a higher reality behind the sacrifice that as a philosopher you could kind of partake of, through deeper understanding that it represents something more than just burning animal meat. Okay, I think you get the idea. And I think that's probably a good place to stop it. You can of course read more of these on your own, but I just want to bring it to your attention that this was this spirit that was very much alive during this late period of paganism, when paganism is already kind of very much on the decline under the influence of the Constantinian revolution, and the ever-growing numbers of the church. That there is this attempt to kind of make philosophically palatable or rationalize the older and perhaps we might even say more troubling elements of Greco-Roman myth. Okay, and with that, I'd say let's put a bookmark in it, and we will continue tomorrow with a lecture on kind of exploring a further aspect of something that we touched upon tonight, namely Julian's edict forbidding that Christians can teach Greek literature. How were Christians to deal with this? It really brought to the fore an issue that had to be dealt with, and that was, how should Christians relate to the literary and intellectual heritage of the Greeks? Should they reject it wholesale? Should they adopt it wholesale? Or should there be some kind of nuanced relationship there, this reevaluation? Of course, I've kind of given it away. That basically is the conclusion that the early church comes to, and we will explore that tomorrow. So until then, my friends, have a wonderful day, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.